about them. So without further ado, I'm going to get off the stage and let this happen. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, good morning. It's wonderful to see so many of our colleagues here today. Just such a great turnout. I think this is the session not to miss at this particular event because we have two of our esteemed colleagues here who, as Thomas noted, have differing opinions. This is not going to be a vicious debate, but rather a point-counterpoint between again, Dr. Mattis and Dr. Popkin. We are going to start the first 10 minutes. Each of them will have time to talk about ultra-processed foods, processed foods. How do we even define that? I think this is an area where no matter who you are, or where you are, you have an opinion about whether or not ultra-processed foods are the root of all evil or whether they perhaps are a solution to some of our hunger and food security concerns. So we'll get into that today. Again, each has 10 minutes. Then we'll follow with some pointed questions to each of them. They'll both have a chance to respond. And then we're going to open it up the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So be thinking about the questions that you might want to ask. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick first to get us started.
Well, thank you very much. I won't waste a minute since time is short and dive right in. So starting in the mid-1800s when we started discovering the different vitamins, it was very logical, appropriate to focus dietary guidance on nutrients. But then we realized that people don't eat nutrients, they eat foods, and so guidance shifted more towards food-based recommendations. But that was a complicated message to convey, and it eventually evolved into talking about food groups to make messaging communication more straightforward. And then starting with Dietary Guidelines 2015, and reinforced in the 2020 panel, an emphasis on diet patterns as a way to give advice to consumers, to the population. But we're at a new pivotal point right now where that orientation towards nutrients, towards foods is being rejected and instead replaced with the concept that food processing is really the basis for setting nutrition policy. So it's a real marked departure from where we have been. And the question is whether that's appropriate. So there are multiple definitions of processed foods. This is an interesting analysis using 4 different ones, and the important point is that they don't agree with each other. You can see I don't have a pointer, unfortunately. The concordance between them is very low. Moreover, their ability to predict health outcomes is quite discrepant. So, for example, the NOVA system in this analysis of Predimed data showed an association between consumption of highly processed foods and BMI, but not the other definitions. The UNC definition showed an association with blood pressure, but not the other groups. So really, we are in a place where definitions are needed. A standardized definition is needed. I'm going to focus mostly on NOVA just because it's the predominant classification system globally. And it's important to recognize that it emphasizes processing, as I said before, but also notice that the issue is also the purpose of processing food. So it's about the science, it's about the food system, but it's also about the purpose of how foods are made, which takes it into the business and the political realm in addition to just the food realm. So if we're going to set policy, I think most would agree that we'd like to have a confluence of evidence from epidemiologic data, so we understand the level of risk, who's particularly at risk, the scope of the problem, controlled clinical data in order to establish causality, and mechanistic data to know the plausibility of this, and if indeed there is a true causal relationship, how to intervene most effectively. So what I'd like to do is spend a couple minutes reviewing the evidence base as I see it now on this topic. Unfortunately, it's not advanced. There we go. Okay, so we'll start with the epidemiology. There is no question, no argument possible that there is an abundance of epidemiologic data showing a positive association between consumption of ultra-processed foods and various health outcomes. I focus on obesity here, tends to be the area I work in the most. This is one meta-analysis. There have been many. I picked this one. This was one of the earlier ones and one of the more highly cited meta-analyses. And it shows there is a statistically significant association between consumption of ultra-processed foods and obesity, or BMI. But I would point out, if you look down at the bottom there, the effect size is very, very small. So it's real, but it's significant because of large sample sizes. Here's data from the EPIC study, again, very large sample size. The effect size here is an increment of 0.1 kilograms over a 5-year period. That's the statistically significant effect reported from this study. So yes, statistically significant. Practically, is it important? That's another matter to be discussed. If you are sort of honest with the scope of the evidence base out there, the range of associations goes from about that 1.02 that I showed you up to about 1.55. There's a lot of discussion about the issue of food processing and health outcomes, but the reality is the amount of variance associated that processing accounts for in terms of obesity, for example, is no greater than the variability associated, accounted for by all of these other factors listed here. So yes, it's real. The epidemiology is solid. There is an association between ultra-processed food consumption and BMI, for example, but the effect size is not particularly strong and no greater than many of the things that we already know about. What about the clinical trials? Well, there's one that has been published with a priori hypothesis about the role of ultra-processed foods. And I want to applaud Kevin Hall and the group for doing it. We have to start the science somewhere, so kudos to him. But we have to look at the science for what it is and where we can gain insight now. So this was a study of 20 individuals, so very small. It was a 2-week intervention on 2 treatment arms, so very short in duration. It used extremely high concentrations of minimally processed and ultra-processed foods, concentrations that were greater than any population consumes. It was a proof of principle study, not a study of testing the reality of what might be the exposure level in the population. And what they found was indeed there was a statistically significant increase in energy intake in the group that was consuming ultra-processed foods when people were consuming the ultra-processed foods as compared to when those same people were consuming minimally processed foods. However, the data also indicated there was a statistically significant negative slope during the time that ultra-processed foods were consumed. And in fact, if you draw a regression line through the 2 data sets, what you see is that it would take just about another week for that effect to disappear. So this is a transient phenomenon, sort of like the cruise ship phenomenon. You put somebody in an unusual setting, give them palatable food that's free, and for a while they will indulge, and then eventually decide, maybe this isn't the best thing for me. So the other point to make is that the increase in energy intake was due to a higher consumption of breakfast and lunch foods, but not dinner or snack foods. All of the foods were either ultra-processed or minimally processed. If processing was really the driver of this, you wouldn't expect to see a distribution like that. There's something other than processing that underlies the increment in energy intake that they reported. So suffice it to say, I think the data are intriguing, but not convincing that this is there is a causal association between consumption of ultra-processed foods and energy intake, or BMI, at this stage. And then in terms of mechanistic studies, a group of students and I did a literature review to try to find what's been published on that. And we came up with these 16 different hypothesized mechanisms. To my reading of the literature, not one of them has been established based on scientific evidence. They're all hypothetical. Obviously, I don't have time to go through all of those to substantiate that perspective. I'll just point out one, the hyperpalatability, because you hear that one so often, that industry has designed foods to be super or hyperpalatable, obviously an inflammatory label to evoke a strong reaction. There is no definition of hyperpalatable in the scientific literature anyhow. But let me just point out that these are very typical data if you do studies on food preferences in populations. So on your left are people of normal weight, on the right, people with obesity, and this is their hedonic rating for lemonade with different levels of sweetness in it. And what you can see is that there are some people that prefer the lowest concentration, some the middle concentration, and some the highest concentration. And it's true for people who are lean, and it's true for people that have obesity. And so if industry was in fact able to design this perfect blend of sensory properties to drive intake, maybe even addict people, the question is who, right? There is no one concentration, there is no one formula that's going to appeal to everybody. Every one of these is going to have a distribution, and so I think there's a lack of credibility of this concept of hyperpalatability being a driver. That's time?
You can have one last word.
Okay, one last word. Okay, I'll just point out, without definitions, without data, it's hard to efficiently or effectively implement policy. And I would argue that there are real concrete potential dangers associated with adoption of this at this point in time, because if we take it out, we lose enriched foods, which are supplying needed nutrients. If we take out preservatives, we risk the increased foodborne illness, and these products are playing an important role for people of limited means.
Hi. So on the other side of the coin, I'll counter a lot of what Rick has to say with real science studies that have been done that he didn't quote or talk about. Some of the largest microbiome studies in the world, studies on dopamine and other receptors, on neurotransmitters, and a number of things that show these foods are quite different. So first I want to talk about the processing, which so you understand. Normally, if you went back to the 1950s and earlier era of food, you got real food, you process it, you added some basic spices and things that you could be in your kitchen, and you got food out. Starting in the 70s and later, we started shifting. And modern food science started creating different parts of our food. They wanted to increase the duration, preserve it to last months. They wanted to diversify preparation, and they wanted to add sensory properties. But in the process of doing all this, what's really happened is the grains are pulled apart. We've taken these crops. They've been modified to such an extent, often at the molecular level. If you saw the food in the middle of the process, you would think it was sawdust or something strange. It doesn't look like real food. But at the end, with the emulsifiers, the colors, the flavors, and all the other things, it's reconstituted to look like a Dorito chip or whatever else. And these foods are huge. They represent 80% of what kids in America eat, 60% of what adults eat, and I'll only talk about the packaged food part, but the fast food part and others is equally immense. And what they've done with the food is they've created food that obviously maximizes profits. It's very shelf stable, terribly cheap, and using modern marketing and everything else, they've sold the public. And what they're doing, if I were to show trends, every country in the world, not one, is not seeing an increase in ultra-processed food intake. So if you're concerned about this for the globe, it starts with infants for America. the toddler milks and other things. I add a lot of sugar and things that infants don't need. And they're quite highly processed. So this is not a simple issue affecting a small number of people in our country or in the world. This goes from birth to death. The ultra-processed substances, they're not things you can find in your kitchen. If you look on the ingredients list on foods, and if you actually had what we have is a file we buy from a special company, the ingredients in the ingredients, you'd be shocked at what's being done. And this is just the ingredients list, and there are things that we can't cook with. There are things we don't use, but that modern food science, we have what we call 12 codex classes. Each of those has hundreds of different ingredients in them. And that's the basis of, in NOVA, they talk about 2 ways to define foods. The food way, but they also talk about the additive categories and flavors. And I'll use that in a second to identify, but I want you to realize that these are really things that are not normal, and these are things that have been developed over time with amazing processing. I mean, we've got a place like Nestle, 5,000 plus food scientists and nutritionists working to create these. Every major food company's a research factory in terms of creating new ways to keep creating food, and inexpensive food. So we took, with our national sample we have every year of Nielsen data, where they have a nationally representative sample, and they list and they take pictures every day of whatever they buy, be it at a vending machine or other, but packaged food with barcodes, not other stuff you get in a fast food store and so on. And with that, we have and we've linked it with 12 RD MPHers to nutrition facts panel data and ingredients to the food packages. From that, in this year, we just took and looked, and we created what was ultra-processed with 2 definitions, just flavors and color categories. Colors is a codex category with hundreds of items. And then with the 12 codex classes mentioned in the NOVA classification, which, and we got this proportion of the diet was high in. We don't deny high in. We don't deny added sugar, sodium, saturated fat are bad. We feel we need to also tell people about the processing, that it's critical. And so you can see the proportion that's high in when you use a reasonable categorization from PAHO or Chile or other countries. And we have more of those that are high in something but aren't highly processed. And the issue that Rick talked about with the Kevin Hall study, it was the most sophisticated RCT you can do. And you don't see people put in a built environment with control on everything about their lives for more than a month at a time, ever. This is the gold standard of random controlled trials, and that he showed you lost 2.2 pounds or you gained it, whether you're on a real food diet or an ultra-processed diet. It's seen by everybody as quite definitive. But this is not the only study. They're the largest microbiome study done in Israel, 1,000 people. There are microbiome studies done here to show a profound change in the microbiome when you consume ultra-processed food. And there's a whole group of psychologists who are pushing to call these foods addictive. That they see certain changes in their neurotransmitters, in the same receptors that affect us with addiction, are affecting us with these foods. And so they're quite different. And there are a lot of metabolic and other studies. We don't have every link on the pathway from ingestion up, but we don't have that for any food. What we have are, we know different steps in the process. And believe me, on the microbiome and on the brain, we have clear scientific studies on this that are accepted in some of the best journals. So there are issues about mechanisms we know. And then this study This was published in the BMJ, the strictest of standards for classifying how foods affect health, how anything affects health. And here they found really significant, strong evidence of several mental health diseases and diabetes, weight gain, and cardiovascular mortality. And then the rest are moderate and suggestive, but they're not weak, like Rick says, when you put together more recent meta-analyses, you find much stronger effects than he noted from one of the very early ones when there weren't many studies done. And it's also the more recent studies that are looking at diets from the last 10 to 20 years, when across the globe, ultra-processed food consumption's gone up. So and if you look at this BMJ study, British Medical Journal, really with the strongest evidence we have today, you have evidence across every chronic disease. We don't have foods that we can identify or eating patterns with brain diseases like we do with mental health problems, as shown in this study. So, and poor nutrition is really killing us. It's not just, as was brought up earlier, sodium. It's the kind of food we're eating. It's killing us, and it's moving the planet toward nutrition-related chronic diseases, disability, and enormous medical costs every day. So I'll end there. Thank you.
For the record, he had 30 seconds left.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I should get up and sit between the two of them. All right, well, so you saw that there was not only maybe some various opinion throughout that, but just even different takes on the research. So what we're going to do now is ask a couple of questions. We'll give them a chance to respond, and then we'll do a counterpoint to that. We've got these ready to go again. Be thinking of your questions. We will start today, since Rick got to go first, we'll start with Barry and then hear from both of them on this question. So the first one is, can technological innovations such as alternative processing methods or food reformulations mitigate the negative health effects associated with these ultra-processed foods?
Well, first, if you go back to real food and processing like we had it long ago, it would be much healthier, in my belief. But secondly, reformulation of ultra-processed food has two elements. When we have evaluated Chile and other countries I work in where we're seeing a major reductions in consumption of adverse nutrients like sodium and sugar. In Chile, within 3 weeks to 2 months after the warning labels came into effect, we saw in about 40% of the high sodium foods a reduction. It was industry had the technology, they implemented it. And we found potassium salts increase significantly and a profound benefit. But they were still ultra-processed foods, but they got rid of the high sodium. Similarly, with sugar, we saw a lot of the same changes with non-nutritive sweeteners, and different people have different opinions on that. Rick have written that we don't think they're so harmful at one point in time, but there's a whole lot of countries and people out there that are now putting warning labels on non-nutritive sweeteners because they're linked with ultra-processed foods. But that also changed, and we saw some saturated fat change. So industry can make changes, but they still remain ultra-processed foods. And to the extent that there's something biological that changes when the food is pulled apart to the molecular level in others and reconstituted that we don't know, is really the big question here that seems to be driving why ultra-processed foods are considered different than real food and their effects.
Great. Okay. Your thoughts on this, Rick?
Yeah, so I kind of have trouble with the question as phrased because I don't think we have an agreement on what an ultra-processed food is, and so how do we use it as a counterpoint? There are, as I said, many definitions out there. There's no question there are foods that we should not eat very often or in large quantities. The question is whether the label ultra-processed identifies those foods, and I would argue that it doesn't. There are foods that are highly processed that are very nutritious and play an important role in meeting nutrient needs in large segments of the population. There are foods that are not nutrient dense, that aren't highly processed, that are problematic. The processing doesn't add clarity to this issue. In fact, I don't think it adds anything more than when we used to call foods junk foods or not, right? Did that help anybody make wiser food choices? I don't think so. And by labeling something ultra-processed, once again, it doesn't really give any guidance at this point.
All right, 30 seconds, rebuttal at all, Barry?
No,
Okay.
I think I've given what I think ultra-processed means. We'll have a Lancet series coming out that we were asked to do by Lancet, and in there, this definition will be told us now, because this is part of the NOVA definitions, what I use, the 12 additive categories, and we already published one article in Lancet Journal about this. So I think that the definition for when you're dealing with packaged food is simpler using the additive categories from Codex, and it's one that the NOVA people are accepting. I mean, this issue, Carlos is involved in one of the papers, I'm involved in the policy paper.
Great. Rick, anything before we go to the next question?
Nah, let's go.
Okay, yeah, you can wrap it into the next answer. So should there be mandatory labeling requirements? You touched on that, about the labeling, but should we be specifically indicating the level of processing in food products to better inform consumers about the nutritional value? Let's start with you first, and then...
Okay, so calling something ultra-processed doesn't really tell you anything about nutrient composition. It has something to do, as Barry said, about perhaps altering the structure of the food and how it's digested, absorbed, and metabolized. So those are two separate issues. Wait, give me
Should we be labeling?
oh, yeah, and processing can be both positive and negative. It can add things that improve nutrient quality, that can improve digestibility, that can improve safety and shelf life for people that don't have means for purchasing food on a short-term basis and so on. So what are you going to say about processing? Some of the processes are good and some are bad. Now we're in the world of having to decide which processes should be on the label. It spirals out of control, I think.
My response is, first, preserving food has been done for millennia. We had ways to preserve food in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, well before ultra-processed food began. We can preserve healthy food, real food that's been processed in one way or another, or we can recompose the food and create ultra-processed food. I think there are different issues, and there's one country right now that has a tax on ultra-processed food. There are countries around the world considering ultra-processed food labels, warning labels, or information boxes. So this is a serious issue. I think consumers' information should require at some point companies to show this. There's a lot, and as it is, every one of those ultra-processed foods in the U.S. is high in added sugar, sodium, or unhealthy saturated fat. So the reality is that it covers both the nutrient concerns that WHO and all the world's medical scientists have, but it also then tells people about processing if they're interested. But if they're not, they can ignore it.
Okay, rebuttal?
Yeah, Barry brings up a good point. If we look over time, I think what we see is that ultra-processing is neither necessary nor sufficient to explain the changes in health status that we've seen. Obesity has been with us for millennia, not just since the food industry decided to start manipulating the structure of foods. And vegans and vegetarians actually have very high intakes of ultra-processed foods, yet they're populations that we think have better nutritional status and greater longevity. So apparently, these processed foods are not necessarily problematic.
I'll just disagree quickly on several points. Vegans do not have more ultra-processed food in their diet, or vegetarians. They have minimal amounts if you look at the data for this country.
I guess we look at different data.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm looking
Let's-
at what they purchase.
We have one more question. I'm going to ask you to answer this with a yes or a no, and then you get 30 seconds before we turn it over to the audience. So should the government implement stricter regulations on the marketing and sale of ultra-processed foods, or recommendations through the dietary guidelines for these processed foods in order to curb rates of obesity and other chronic diseases? And so, Barry, yes or no? 30 seconds.
Yes, I think I've shown convincing evidence, and when they affect mortality at the levels they do, it's pretty scary. They're much higher size effects than we see for most foods.
Okay.
No, because that labeling doesn't provide any real insight. It just creates a mentality of good food and bad food. I have to say, I'm an old-time dietitian. I believe that any food can be incorporated into a healthful diet. It's just a matter of how often and how much. When we create good food, bad food, especially when we're talking about foods that represent upwards of 60% of the food that we're eating, we're talking about promoting a behavioral change that is massive. And we don't know what the health outcomes will be of such a radical change if it were in fact implemented.
Okay, you heard it here first, yes and no. We've got time now to take your questions, so if you would like to come to the podium and direct it to one of our speakers, we'll let them answer, and then of course we'll give the other an opportunity to answer as well.
Hi, I'm Jeanne Black. I'm a reporter. This is for, I guess, for Rick, but for either. You sort of answered this question, but I just want to put a little bit of a finer point on it, which is that it seems to me that, like, I understand why this is a debate. People want a scientific answer, but it also seems like it's a way to draw attention to consumers, or, you know, just to kind of make people pay attention to something that we sort of already know is true. Like, we all know that eating a Cheeto is less good for you than eating some spinach or even eating a plate of steak and potatoes. What we have to do to change that is to change things that are difficult, subsidies, all kinds of regulations. So instead, let's pour all this energy into figuring out what kind of processing affects it and why, so that we can put a label on it. Do you feel like this is answering a question that we don't know the answer to already?
Well, we
Rick gets to
obviously,
go first.
Either one.
I mean, we all agree that junk food, much of which is certainly high in sodium, saturated fat, and sugar, and usually two of those categories, is unhealthy. And when you look at the ultra-processed food and what we buy in America, you see that it's all high in. So it's just another way to inform the public here and globally about their food. People can act on it or not, and there'll be a lot of people that will ignore it. We have people that ignore every health warning in the world, and they're hypertensive and they're eating bags of sugar, salty food all the time. So we don't want to top individual freedom, but we clearly want to inform the public. And I believe this is a concept and this is an issue that will help some of the public. It'll be up to scientists and others to convince them one way or the other. And this is just one example of the debates going on globally. But increasingly, the literature is showing more and more ultra-processed food impacts, biological and other.
So I worry about using inflammatory messaging to mobilize consumer awareness and behavior when we don't have the science to substantiate that messaging is actually valid. We don't have any evidence of causality at this point. I agree with Barry, there's a lot of epidemiology showing association, but association is not very reliable. If I can use an example from Julie Jones, I think everybody in this room would agree that there's an association between drinking cocktails and traffic accidents. If you didn't know anything about mechanism, you'd be just as likely to blame the tonic water as the alcohol, right? You've got to understand mechanism before you start making recommendations about how to change behavior and policy. We just don't have that data now. And I would say if there wasn't much of a downside of making this change, well, maybe it's worth a try, but I really believe there are tangible adverse consequences of moving at this point for single parent families. That's about 30% of the US population. They need convenience foods. They don't have the time to go shopping every day and prepare everything from scratch. That's just practical reality. There are people that have very limited resources for storing food, preparing food. They need convenience foods. Convenience food has become a villain. That term has become very negative, but it plays an important role in many people's lives. It could be done better, sure, but to reject it just on labeling as a messaging tool, I think it's dangerous.
Since there's
I
no one
want to
behind
just
me.
add very quickly, I'm not condemning convenience and ready-to-eat food. They can be healthy, real food, and minimally processed or processed in the old ways, or they can be this new ultra-processed with all these additives, colors, flavors added, and you'd be shocked how many. I mean, 90% of that U.S. food supply has dozens of these codex additives and colors and emulsifiers.
I just worry that as a member of the media, that more attention and more research will go into this and pull away from the foundational problems with the junk food in the first place that won't help people who need convenience foods get actual healthy convenience foods.
Thank you, thank you. All right, one more question.
This is so spicy. I really, I really love it. And so I'm Daphne Altima Johnson. I am the researcher/dietitian at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. And I get it. I honestly can see both perspectives, right? Working with consumers, working with those that are affected with obesity and cardiovascular issues and et cetera. But I also, being an immigrant, I also understand how simple it is to just eat whole foods and deal with some of the issues that we have in the U.S. But something was said about the labels, that we should just put, it's ultra processed on the labels. And I can understand that if there is an education behind that. We talk about how one of the reasons is because it allows for access, right, and convenience, especially for those marginalized communities that are unable to access those food or that need something, single parents, whatever the case might be. But we are making an assumption, that they actually know what that means. And look, we have two excellent researchers that actually can't even agree, right? There's different sides, and both are valid, right? Both are valid, but we are putting it on consumers.
Can
to
you
make
ask
a
your
very-
questions? We're at the end of time, so
Yeah,
if you can.
so how do we address that? And how should the guidelines that for people like me that use the guidelines to make a decision to educate, how do you advise the guidelines and others to address this? To what is the middle line? What is the silver lining here?
Let's start with you and then.
Okay. Yeah,
Rick, you first.
Okay, yeah, my perspective is to not use labels that we can't substantiate. To me, the best dietary guidance has been and probably always will be is balance, moderation, and variety. The problem is we haven't figured out a way to message that effectively. We have science to show that is healthful, beneficial advice. We don't have evidence that these other labels are actually going to lead to the goal that we intend.
I'm very involved in policy and working with dozens of countries around the world. Right now, we've been focused more on high-end added sugar, sodium saturated fat, where the evidence is quite conclusive. We're looking at the same kind of data for a number of countries where we have nationally representative purchasing to see, in fact, if the high-end covers everything. The reason to think about processing is because the way the food is taken apart seems to be doing something to us that we have never had the neurotransmitter results. Even with we had the old red dye scares decades ago, and we thought kids were hyperactive because they had red dye in their food. We've had tons of scares like that, but this hits at different mechanisms that we've never seen before. The fact that it's related not only to the normal cardiometabolic outcomes, but to all these other mental health and other things says it's different. And because of that, we have actually now psychologists thinking of changing the addiction handbook part of their psychological guidance for what's addictive to include ultra-processed food. So there's something there. And how far it reaches into what we can have consensus. We have half of the nutritionists in the world funded by the food industry. Are we going to have a consensus with people who come from it's very difficult. And so at some point, we have to base it on what we think is best for public health. We have to think of whether the evidence is strong enough to say people could use that information or not. Whether it be like one country, a large country that's thinking of taxing ultra-processed foods, that'll be up to each country with the information and sifting it. But I will say there's an enormous split among nutritionists. And public health side is very different than the side focused on standard nutrition when it comes to these issues. And a lot has to do, not completely. Rick is a great scientist who isn't bought by industry, but a hell of a lot of people are. And a hell of a lot of people live by that. So we have to realize there's always going to be, industry wants ultra-processed food. The profits they've made, the size of these companies dwarf 90% of the countries in the world, GNP.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Poppy. Thank you, Jeanne.
We've gotten to the end here of our session. I think you can see how challenging it is for a group like the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee to look at the research and reach consensus. Whether or not we're there yet with ultra-processed foods, I think that remains to be seen, but you can see there's definitely a healthy discord among the scientists that we have on the stage. I want to thank you both for being here today, and thanks to all of you. Pass it back to Thomas. Let's give him a round of applause.
Okay, so now just tell